What year did you enlist in the Navy?
February 1967.
Now, were you one of these guys, Navy guys, who think, here's just the story I've heard a number of times. Either the draft notice has come, or I know
Yes,
I'm going to get drafted, so I'm going to enlist, and I'll join the Navy, and that means I'll be on a supply boat 30 miles off the coast of Vietnam, and I'll never get involved.
exactly my thought process. I actually received my draft notice. My sister brought it in from the mail, and she said, Richie, you got something from the government. And I opened it up and it started out greetings. And I said, oh shit, man. I said, I've been drafted. I immediately went to the Navy Recruiting Center in Miami. I walked in and I went, how long does it take to do this? Can I do it before this takes effect? And they went, I can sign you up right now, man. I said, okay. And they said, what do you want to do in the Navy? I said, I don't know. What are my options? So the guy talked me into, at that point, into enlisting for 6 years because he promised me, which became reality, a 2 year school of basic electronics and electricity to become an electrician in the Navy. But after boot camp, which also was another cool experience because of the fact that when we reported to the induction center in Miami that day, you got to remember back then, I mean, this was the 60s, right? Everybody was anti war. Everybody was trying to get out of this. There were people that showed up at the induction center that day naked. There were guys that showed up drunk. There were guys that showed up with their mothers pleading and begging not to take their sons. There were only 4 of us that day going to the Navy. Remember, it was February. And there was a Navy lieutenant down there dressed in his dress whites. And he took the 4 of us aside and he said, look, he says, you guys are enlistees. He says, you're not draftees. He says, I'm going to do you a big favor. He goes, I'm going to give you your choice of boot camp right now. And at the time, the Navy only had 2, San Diego and Chicago. And it was February. Well, it was unanimous. We were going to San Diego. And he got us a flight on a Delta flight to San Diego, and we went there. And we were very happy about that. And so went to boot camp, got out. I was assigned to basic electronics and electricity school. I went to phase A of that, and then I read my enlistment paper again. And it said that this deal was contingent upon completion of phase A1. I decided at boot camp that I didn't want to spend 6 years in the Navy. I went down to the office there and I said, I quit. I don't want to go to school anymore. And they said, which would negate the 6 year commitment. And then they gave me the threat that they gave everybody. Well, you're going to end up in the fleet. I went, well, basically that's why I joined the Navy, so I don't care. And that's how I ended up getting stationed on the USS Banner, which when I got those orders, I took it around almost everybody on the base I was on at Treasure Island, where that basic electronics school was. Nobody knew what an AGER was. And then I went off to Japan. I landed in Tachikawa. Some guy in a bus took us down, a few guys down to Yokosuka. My ship that I was stationed on wasn't in port at the time. It was still out. So I went to the bachelor enlisted quarters, stayed there for 2 weeks and shot pool. Ship came back in. Still, nobody on the base knew what that ship was. It had its own dock, no other ships around it. Nobody knew anything about it. And I figured, God, this is kind of weird. I said, because I know all about destroyers and aircraft carriers and oilers and tankers and all that. And finally it came in and I was disgusted when I saw it. It was the ugliest little ship I ever saw. It was small, old. And I went aboard and, got my billet and all that stuff and got assigned. And then they sat us down for an orientation and we had to get a clearance. So they did a background check and we got a clearance to be on that ship. And then I found out what it was. It was an electronics listening ship that operated either off of China, Korea, or Russia. And our first trip out, I mean, I was seasick for 30 days, man. I lost 20 pounds. It was horrible. It only had a 13-foot draft with a round bottom. And we were in a place that was 30 below zero. I was from Miami. Bear that in mind. We were off the coast of Vladivostok, Siberia, about 12 miles out in the Gulf of Kamchatka. And I remember standing helm watch one night, and the captain came up. And bear in mind that there was only 62 people on that ship. So everybody knew everybody. Half of the crew were CTs, communication techs. These were the spooks, the guys that spoke different languages and were the tech guys that listened in and whatever it was they did. And the rest of us were crew members, not privy to certain spots on the ship. But I remember standing on the helm and it's snowing out and we're chopping ice and the sea is 20 feet and the ship's rocking back and forth and everybody's freezing. And I remember the captain came by and I went, "Captain, excuse me a minute, can I talk to you?" And he goes, "Yeah, what is it, Kirshen?" And I go, "Sir," I says, "I'm from Miami. I shouldn't really be here." And he just laughed and walked away.
Yeah, that's not gonna work. Yeah, that's not gonna work.
I ended up making like 6 or 7 or 8 trips on that ship. First there, then back to Yokosuka for 6 days. Then we'd head down to the Yellow Sea where it was like 100 degrees out and the ocean was flat as a desert. And so you're sweating your ass off and you're going through like 120 or 130-degree temperature change in a week or two. And then we'd end up off Korea. But off China, they found us there and they chased us out of there with a Chinese gunboat. They didn't shoot at us or anything, but they just chased us out, which they could. Our top speed was like 14 knots. That was it. And we had no armament at the time. After the Pueblo got captured, they put a couple of 20 millimeter anti-aircraft cannons on there, and I became gunner on one of those. So they took us out for trials and they put these 50-gallon drums with a little bit of gasoline out in water. And then they drifted away and we had to try to hit them. And then they exploded just to learn how to fire these things. And I spent that 7 or 8 months on there till the Pueblo got captured. And then they ended up in dive school from there.
So on that ship, you've got the linguists, the guys who know Russian, Mandarin, Korean.
Right.
Was there much interaction between those guys and the crew members, or was there kind of a division?
Well, yeah, but only because we had the same living spaces. It was very limited on that ship. There was just like a large compartment with electronic gear in it that the rest of the crew couldn't go into. But other than that, we all ate together and played cards together and, intermingled. She actually took our trip on the one that she got captured on. We were scheduled to do that trip off of Korea. And their captain, what was it, Lloyd Booker, he told our captain, he says, "Come on, we'll give you a break. We'll take this trip. You guys been doing this for a year, 30 days out, 6 in, 30 out, 6 in, for a year, almost a year before Pueblo." And they took our trip, and that's when that happened. After the Pueblo got captured, they sent that whole big fleet out with the Enterprise and all these other ships off the coast, and we went with them. And we sat out there for 30 days. And then we went back to Yokosuka, and we were told, "You're never going out again because all this electronic listening devices and stuff you have is now compromised. So it's not any good anymore." Because they had it all.
Yeah.
And so, first of all, I was an E3. I couldn't afford to stay in Japan all that time. So I told the ship's yeoman, I says, "What can we do to get me off of this piece of crap?" I said, "I'll do anything." And about 2 weeks after I mentioned that to the yeoman, he came into me one day with a sheet of paper and he said, "Look at this." And I look at it and it was a thing put out by BUPERS, or Bureau of Personnel, that said, "Navy's looking for volunteers to go to dive school." I said, "Sign me up." Right there, immediately. I said, "Sign me up." So we were in Yokosuka, Japan. The closest Navy dive school was in Subic Bay in the Philippines, about 2,000 miles away. The problem was that the class started in 1 week, and there wasn't time to get me orders from Bureau of Personnel to get me there. But I don't know if you know this or not. I'm Jewish, all right? The only other Jewish person on our ship was the executive officer. I went and talked to him. I showed him and I presented what the problem was. I said, I really want to go. I want to get off. Nothing personal with you, but I don't want to be on the ship anymore. As first of all, I can't afford it. Second of all we do is sit here. We don't do anything anymore. We serve no function. I says, can you get me to dive school? And what this guy did was he said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. He says, but you have to deny any knowledge of this whatsoever. And he made me up fake orders to go to dive school, got me a flight out of Tachikawa. He said, when and if you graduate, you're not going to have any orders because Bureau of Personnel isn't going to know you're there. He says, so when you get out, just play stupid and chalk it up to a paper error. And so I went to dive school. It lasted like 14 weeks. We started with a class of 16. 4 of us graduated. The 3 guys all had orders waiting for them. I had none. The dive master there was wondering, how come you don't have orders? I go, I have no idea. They chalked it up to a paper error. They sent all the paperwork to Bupers that I had gone through the training, that I had passed. I'm now a certified Navy diver. I waited about another 3 weeks there, did dive work in and around Subic Bay. And then I got orders to an organization. It was an experimental organization at the time called IUWG-1, the Inshore Undersea Warfare Group. They sent me to Coronado Island for some training there. I was there for a couple of weeks, and then I ended up almost immediately back in Cam Ranh Bay as the base diver there with one other guy. And I started making dives, doing all kinds of stuff up and down the coast. People were borrowing us from the base to do specific jobs up and down the coast. We were doing jobs right there in Cam Ranh Bay, setting up underwater lighting systems, underwater listening devices, salvage work, minor repair. Ships would come in with stuff around their screws. They'd anchor out. We'd go out there and dive and clear their screws of bamboo or whatever was around it. We would guide boats into the floating dry docks, things like that. We did demolition work up and down the coast of mostly sunken boats that were impeding river traffic. We would go in and blow them up so that they didn't impede river traffic anymore. And then after about 4 or 5 months in Cam Ranh Bay, I was told one day that my services were needed elsewhere, because my other job in Cam Ranh Bay, by the way, besides base diver, was driving a Mike 6 boat. Every morning I would go across the bay and pick up the indigenous personnel that worked on the base. And then in the afternoon, drive them back to their village, about 50 people each time. And so I knew how to drive a boat at that time. And so they said the attrition rate on the rivers was much higher than that of divers. And since I knew how to do that, they were sending me down there on temporary duty. And that's how I ended up down on the rivers.
And one of the things I'm interested in when I talk to Vietnam vets, who serve in very different capacities, I'm always interested in what the war looked like to them. So, for example, a Loach pilot, the war is going to have a certain look to a pilot of a Scout Helo. That's going to be a very different look from, a guy who's got an office job.
Right.
In Da Nang, what does the war look like to him? So if you just isolate your time as a Navy diver, based at Cam Ranh,
right.
Let's say that's what your whole tour was. You're a diver there based at Cam Ranh. What would the Vietnam War have looked like to you just from the perspective of a Navy diver? What did the war look like from that perspective?
My perspective would have been that I was doing a support job. I was supporting, like it was very important, I realized, to set up, because there were some sapper attacks and underwater swimmer attacks from the enemy. But once we set up that underwater lighting system, that didn't happen anymore, because whoever was on watch could see out 50 or 100 feet and be warned of anybody coming in, which prior to that, some guy could sneak in at night, or putting in these little underwater listening devices and stuff that somebody was manning somewhere. or fixing ships so they could go back on the line. Because as a diver, you weren't really subject to combat. You were doing support work that either saved people's lives or made the situation safer or opened up rivers that were not navigable because there were boats in the way or debris in the way that we would go in and blow up. And that's mostly what we did. So my perspective from there was, I'm helping these guys out. And other than the inherent danger of just being a diver, I wasn't really in danger of combat at that time because there was very few instances where, both of those came head to head, diving and combat. So that was my perspective. I was a support guy helping save other people and maybe making some people's lives easier over there and safer.